We're in an unprecedented time right now for artists to get what they're owed. Not only has the Writers Guild of America been on strike since May 2nd, but the actors joined them on July 14th. This isn't unique to the film and television industry. There's a wide array of various coalitions that are in a fight for the creatives they represent, like the American Federation of Musicians fighting for venue standards for the freelancers, or the Animation Guild getting their historic win back in May 2022 after the writers were getting paid less than half of a live-action writer's pay, which isn't saying much. Then there are the calls for more groups of workers in creative fields to unionize, like the ever-growing support for Game Workers Unite, which seek to improve working conditions, reduce crunch time, and as with every industry, fair and steady wages. This problem is especially prevalent in the comic book industry. Right now, a good average rate I found for a line artist, the person who pencils and inks the interior artwork of a comic, typically receives about $250 per page. After 22 pages, that's $5,500 for one issue that they submit monthly. And all in all, that's really nothing to sneeze at. Although there are many other factors that need to be considered, like how long between each gig was, and the working conditions it took to make said issue. And that's not even getting into the ownership of the work that was created. But through the constant efforts of comic book creators over the years, there has been massive steps in the right direction. So let's get into it. The story of comic book creators winning starts with the early days when they were getting screwed over left and right. It's often said that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were only paid $130 for creating Superman at $10 a page for Action Comics #1. Jack the King Kirby himself, one of the most influential comic book creators of all time, only ever received up to $50 per page for writing and artwork and never received any kind of royalties during his lifetime. Bill Finger, the co-creator of Batman, died penniless and alone because Bob Kane hid the fact that he was a ghostwriter. This section is kind of a bummer, but one fun fact is that Bill Finger was a very accomplished screenwriter and even found his way to writing 2 episodes of the 1966 Batman series, which was the only time he got to see his name attached to any Batman project while he was alive. Can you imagine a studio executive being like, "So, do you have any experience with these Batman characters?" Yes. And these are just the famous creators that we know about. That's not even getting into all the countless examples of black comic book creators in the Golden Age who were paid Depression-era wages and left entirely uncredited for their works. Like E.C. Stoner, who has been almost entirely left out of the history books, despite being one of the first black comic book artists and talent behind the original Blue Beetle. And it's been said that he was actually the one who penciled and wrote Speed Saunders and the River Patrol, the first story in Detective Comics #1. The very first effort to unionize wasn't until the 70s when Stan Lee and Carmine Infantino, the editors of Marvel and DC at the time, created the Academy of Comic Book Arts. Lee had envisioned the Academy as a version of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, filled with the lavish award shows and public events that made the comic book life seem all that glamorous. One of the early key members of the Academy was Neil Adams, co-creator of Jon Stewart and much of the Green Lantern Green Arrow comics. Now, Adams had worked across the entire industry, doing every single job of writing, penciling, inking, and lettering for everyone from Archie Comics to DC to Marvel. He scraped by making $32 a page, and this man has done it all, seen it all, and rubbed elbows with nearly every single person at the bottom ring of every publisher. At the very first meeting, when Stan Lee was focused on all of the self-congratulatory banquets and galas, Neil Adams immediately interjected and started talking about increasing page rates, royalties, and creating a pension system for its members. Yeah, Stan Lee walked away from the organization and it folded in 1977, but the fire in Neil Adams kept burning. With 1978's film Superman just around the corner, Neil Adams sought to right some of the wrongs of the Golden Age. He wanted to give Siegel and Shuster anything from the massive amount of money DC earned, but only gave him that $130. The two men were now nearly destitute, so Adams started a grassroots campaign of other creators to create a public relations campaign against the publisher, and they won. According to the argument, the two men received stipends that rose annually, medical benefits, and their names will forever be credited in every single Superman story. Neil Adams' next venture was to create the Comic Book Creators Guild, along with Paul Levitz, Jim Shooter, Frank Miller, Walt Simonson, and Chris Claremont. One of the group's first tasks was stepping in and preventing Marvel from coercing freelancers and signing away more of their rights away. Then, it was to increase page rates for all creators. What they saw was $300 per page for line artists and $100 for writers. That's not adjusted for inflation. That would actually be $1,403 and $467 respectively in today's money. Of course, that didn't go through, and the proposed guild didn't pan out either. But still, A large percentage of comic book artists today aren't even making what the Guild was fighting for back in the 70s. Let that sink in. The 80s were mostly just baby steps in the right direction. Marvel launched a new anthology magazine called Epic Illustrated that allowed writers and artists to have ownership rights, receive royalties for those issues, and it published without the Comic Code Authority compliance. It even spun off into the Epic imprint, and there were a lot of small successes here and there, like Frank Miller's Electro Lives Again, or Wendy and Richard Pini's ElfQuest. But of course, that imprint was canceled a few years later for cost reasons. Then, everything changed with Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen. It was a cynical look at what life would be like if superheroes were in our real world. It called out the industry for its over-sexualization of female characters, the grotesque depictions of gun-wielding vigilantes, and the flawed logic behind many of the heroes. And it sold better than anyone could have ever imagined. Moore was just a work for hire. The contract stipulated that if the series ever stopped production for a year, he could have the rights back. Except the franchise is too successful, and DC will always keep pushing out reprints, sequels, prequels, crossovers, adaptations, TV series, and everything else. They've tried giving Moore some hush money to just brush it all under the rug, but to him, it's not about the money. It's about his art being bastardized for a quick buck. Alan Moore, Neil Adams, Frank Miller, and many more creators fought hard for artists like Jack Kirby to, at the very least, get the original artwork that they created back in the day, under the Copyright Act of 1976. Marvel's response to Kirby was that if he signed a release saying that he gave up all copyright, forgo all royalties, and admit that he was a work for hire, maybe they'd give him some of his pages back. Only 88 pages, though, of the over 13,000 he made over his career at just Marvel. In 1988, there was another attempt at making the Creators' Bill of Rights to protect writers and artists, but it again went nowhere. Just very itty-bitty baby steps, but progress was coming. It should be noted that around this time, comic books were now becoming a juggernaut of a medium. Fan conventions like San Diego Comic-Con now rose up, the properties were now all over pop culture, and the comic book creators themselves were now becoming the marquee attraction to otherwise floundering issues. Then, a copy of Action Comics #1 goes to auction and rakes in $26,000. Just a few bits of paper that sold for 10 cents back in the day could now be worth millions. What could go wrong? It's free money. I mean, technically, there's actually many reasons people didn't consider, like the fact that there weren't many issues created, and only a handful of those issues are even known to be in good condition. It was the most influential comic book that kickstarted the superhero craze, and it sold around the time of the death of Superman, which in itself grabbed the mainstream's attention. But that didn't matter. Investors saw gold in anything that had a #1 on the cover, or if it was shiny and cool looking. Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man #1 sells 2.5 million copies. Rob Liefeld's X-Force #1 sells 5 million copies. Then Jim Lee's X-Men #1 still holds the highest-selling single-issue comic record to this day at 8 million copies. And the creators didn't even get any kind of acknowledgement. Very famously, one of the final straws for McFarlane was that he saw his cover art all over posters, stickers, and t-shirts. And they wouldn't even give him one. But this would lead to possibly the greatest step forward for comic book creators getting their due: the creation of Image Comics. The success of Image came from how the company was run. First and foremost, the company only owned the rights to the Image name and eye logo. The creators kept everything else. And secondly, no partner was allowed to interfere with another partner's work. Image was less like one publisher where every character fell under the same collected universe, but more like a loose collection of imprints that banded together to create one unified group. Think of it like if Marvel was the United Kingdom, with the X-Men, Spider-Man, the Avengers, and the others as each individual kingdom just still falling under the same rule of the Crown of England. That would make Image more like the United States. Each imprint was ran completely different from the other, would have its own style and tell their own stories, with massive hits like Spawn, Youngblood, Savage Dragon, Shadowhawk, Cyberforce, and many, many more. Image quickly rose to become the #3 publisher, just behind Marvel and DC after their 50-year head start. Then the cracks started to form. The 7 founders of Image were fantastic writers and artists, don't get me wrong. They just weren't the best on the business side of things. Deadlines were missed, and the quality of each comic was very inconsistent. And just as the speculators realized that you can't make $1 million selling a comic book to somebody who already has 20 issues of it, the bubble burst. In an era where selling more than 1 million copies was becoming the norm, since the burst of the late 90s, only one single issue comic has ever managed to break that, and that was 2015's Star Wars #1. It's not all doom and gloom, though. What turned things around in the eyes of the public was the rise of the superhero films and TV shows based off comic books. Comic books were slowly regrowing their audience again, and Image Comics began to expand into other genres of comic books, like fantasy, comedy, and horror. And the promise of Image Comics' founding was carried on with Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead. The comic series was wholly original, and it brought attention back to Image Comics. Kirkman was named partner and is the only non-founder to become one to this day. Which brings us to now in 2023, and creators at Image Comics recently voted to unionize as Comic Book Workers United, the very first union after over 50 years of attempts. It wasn't easy, but the fight was finally worth it. Comic books are a huge part of my life, as I assume with many of yours as well, and it's not even that unreasonable to expect that the people who create the things we enjoy to not have to work in terrible conditions for terrible pay. But that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear from you guys down in the comments below. And of course, if you liked today's video, please hit that like button and subscribe for more weekly content on comic books and nerd stuff. I've been Eric, and you've been awesome.